flow, but it's really just about getting down to that root source is where, the healing can really happen. So again, I think there's a really beautiful opportunity to just sort of find where those parallels are,
Mhm.
and find our sort of rootedness, within ourselves. I think, the idea of wisdom came up in that chapter just because I think trees are such a source of just, they can be so old and just like
Mhm.
have stood still for so long. And yeah, I think one woman who I interviewed called trees, the great meditators, which I thought was just a beautiful analogy. So I think that there's just so much to connect to in forests, and it's forest bathing is such a fun practice because it sort of just forces you to slow down and really take in your environment when you do.
Namaste and welcome back to the True to Yourself podcast, a place where we explore the power of authentic living. This month, in our Circle of Life community program, and here on the True to Yourself podcast, we've been talking about the power of stability. Having this power means being able to say yes to the experiences and relationships that support you and no to those that don't. Having this power means cultivating the courage to go inward, develop balance and groundedness from within. One of the most powerful ways I know of to cultivate this power of stability is by connecting with nature. Today, I'm joined by the wonderful Emma Loewe about her new book, Return to Nature, the new science of how natural landscapes restore us. Emma takes us on a journey through 8 different landscapes, like deserts and drylands, oceans and coasts, and ice and snow, and shares insights gathered from science, personal experience, and interviews. She shows us how each place is really unique in the way it uplifts and supports life. When we lean into what nature can share, we discover so much more than just desolate deserts or frozen ground. We discover our deepest roots. Okay, so welcome back to the True to Yourself podcast. My name is Ananta, and I am so happy to explore with you the power of authentic living. Today we have a very special guest, Emma Lowe. Emma is an editor and author based in New York City. She is the Health and Sustainability Director at mindbodygreen.com, the author of Return to Nature, the new science of how natural landscapes restore us, and the co-author of The Spirit Almanac, a modern guide to ancient self-care. Her writing explores the intersection of nature, human health, and climate activism, and has appeared in Grist, Bloomberg News, and Bustle, among others. Emma received her BA in Environmental Science and Policy with a specialty in environmental communications from Duke University. Welcome, Emma, officially to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you, and I would love to just begin by asking you about a time in your life when you were true to yourself and how it altered or changed the course of your life forever from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this question because, it really allows me to get a bit reflective, which I sometimes need a push to do. So I loved thinking about it. And I think for me, the first sort of answer that came up is just in my career, when I was first getting started out of college, I sort of didn't know what I wanted to do. A lot of my friends were going into, various fields like financial fields and just sort of like more, mainstream, post-college fields. But um, growing up, both of my parents were journalists, so I always was just surrounded by words and by writing. And I think there's something in me that just really wanted to explore that. So decided to go against the grain and, become a writer, which, is definitely a difficult path to take, but I'm so grateful that I did, because it's really led me to meet so many incredible people and have the opportunity to just learn a ton about a ton of different things. So I'm very grateful.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's so amazing that you've also been able to incorporate your love of environmentalism into your writing. So tell us a little bit about the journey of writing your amazing book, The Return to Nature, which I have here with me.
Yeah. So Return to Nature. I should back up a bit. So at Mind Body Green, which for those who are unfamiliar, it's a health and wellness publication, but it takes a pretty holistic, wide-ranging view on what it means to be healthy. So, we would also consider living a life that is, gentle on the planet to be a healthier way of living. So at Mind Body Green, I've been there for about going on 8 years now. And I've done
Wow.
a lot of reporting just about that sort of intersection of sustainability and human health. And I think it's just such a fascinating, space to be in. And over the years, when I've, chatted with a bunch of different types of experts in environmentalism, activists, researchers, all the sort, I tend to ask people a lot about, what first got them into the field, what first got them interested in the work that they're doing.
Hmm.
And I found that a lot of people could really point to an experience that they had out in nature that was just really, touched them and sort of inspired them to take more action to protect their environment. And then, went on to do these crazy, brilliant, amazing things. So I was inspired to put out a resource that just helped people get outside more and just, through that lens, just connect to the world around them and really question how they were helping this world in return that's, given them so much. So that was sort of the lens that I approached the book with. And it's divided into 8 different chapters. Each chapter is a different landscape. So think, beaches, mountains, forests. And it sort of gives or an explanation of why being out in that place is so good for us, just on, a physical and mental level. But then it also provides, rituals that people can do in these spaces to really connect to the environment. And then finally, it provides actions that people can take to, protect that landscape moving forward. So it's kind of a fun culmination of all my interests.
Yeah, that's so inspiring and amazing that you've been able to go so deep into all of these things and how your work is also supporting you to be an environmental activist in the unique way that you're doing it. And what I loved so much about your book as an Ayurveda practitioner is that we have this principle in Ayurveda of the fundamental unity between the individual, which is the microcosm, and the universe or the world outside of us, which is considered the macrocosm. We believe that we are one and the same as the natural world, and that our body and mind is constituted of the same 5 great elements that we find in nature. So anything we want to learn or uncover about ourselves, we can look to the natural world to teach us or to help us tune into within ourselves. So I love how you have also created a bridge, I feel, through your book for people to really see how they can also connect with these various landscapes as a way to deepen their own experiences and their own healing in different ways, in different need states, if you will, that people have, including dealing with trauma, which I think came up in the Oceans and Coasts
Mm-hmm.
chapter, where it deals with the subconscious. And I just found it so fascinating how you're connecting the human development journey with the natural world. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's so much to unpack there. And I feel like your book does a beautiful job of doing that too. I have it right
Oh,
here. It's so
thank
beautiful.
you.
Um, but yeah, I feel like there are just so many, different parallels that can be drawn, both as you mentioned from an Ayurvedic perspective. I think from a climate perspective as well, it's interesting to consider, this idea that we're sort of, polluting the planet that we live on, and just
Mhm.
drawing parallels between like how is doing something like that also harming our own health in turn, and just finding where those connections sort of, lie, whether it be, air pollution, which also comes back to, the air that we breathe and makes us, more susceptible to certain diseases. So I really don't think you can disentangle that connection. And, for better or worse, I think that the whole point of, writing this book was also just to show people that, getting out into nature and really embracing this reciprocal relationship that we always have with the world around us can be so healing. And I think there's real power in just going back to that.
Yeah, definitely. And you talked about a really interesting study, I think, with the oceans and coasts around how I think like scuba diving or something like that, surfing maybe was an activity that was recommended for people to overcome like fears related to
Mhm.
trauma. I thought that was so interesting. Could you highlight that story a little bit more for us?
Yeah, definitely. So that I believe it was a study done, well, there are a few different things. I mean, so surf therapy in general is sort of this idea of, yes, using surfing as a vehicle to like connect with the ocean. And it's typically, done by folks who are just learning to surf for the first time. And, there's obviously a fair amount of like fear and, getting out onto
Hmm.
the waves in that sort of new way.
Yeah.
But what surf therapist practitioners are finding is that by overcoming that fear and really learning to like sort of dance with that, unknown, if you will, it's also
Hmm.
helping people overcome issues like trauma. So I talked with one practitioner who works specifically with sexual abuse advisors, or I'm sorry, survivors, and brings them out onto the surfboard and sort of lets them, have that sort of moment of almost like conquering fear and conquering what lies beneath. And just finding that really empowering across all aspects of their lives. So I think it's interesting to consider. And I'm sure it isn't just, something that happens with surfing. I think any sort of, conquering of fear while you're outdoors in a natural environment can just be so, so healing.
Yeah, that's so amazing. Really, really interesting. I also found it really interesting how you mentioned about, I believe it was the deserts and drylands being a space in which you can expand your perspective and your horizons because you literally just see nothing but broad nature for miles and miles, and what that does for the human brain and creativity and things like that. And that was really interesting because I never ever would have thought of a desert as being a place to inspire creativity. Can you share a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I loved writing that chapter too, because I feel like I didn't grow up in a desert environment and it's not a place that I necessarily feel comfortable in. Like it just feels kind of unfamiliar to me. So it was fun to lean into like, okay, what does this landscape, have to offer and what can be really found there? And the creativity component, I learned about that when I was interviewing a neuroscientist who was talking about this idea that when we're sort of stumped on a mental problem, if you think about it, like a lot of times I'm demonstrating, people can't see, but you'll like inherently look at like a blank wall or, a white open space. And it's sort of a way that our brains intuitively know to like clear the mind, so to speak, is you're sort of just, tuning out outward distractions so you can focus on the task at hand. And so by that principle, it's looking out onto a vast horizon can actually like really open up our mental capacity to like come to creative solutions and draw new, parallels between things, which I thought was super cool. And, again, that can happen in different landscapes, but I think the desert really provides a unique opportunity just because it does tend to be flat, open, have that like expansive sky overhead. So that was sort of a fun thing to think about. But, wherever you live, if you have a moment and you feel a little stumped on a problem, I think I would recommend just looking outside and looking at, the skyline or just, an open view and seeing if it helps.
I love that. Yeah, I love how your book gives these ideas of what kind of benefits you can derive out of all different kinds of landscapes, including city parks and gardens, and then how to cultivate that connection wherever you live, regardless of whether you are even close to such places. I thought that was really unique and really amazing in terms of deepening and cultivating our connection with nature, even if we're not able to visit or be close to all these different parts of the world. And just, like I first, for example, grew up in Toledo, Ohio, which is in the Midwest of the United States, where it's really cold in the winter and it snows a lot and we have ice and snow and, sleet and all of that. And
Yeah.
it's fun, like when it snows on Christmas Day and stuff like that. And you see like the white color covering everything. And then it's like, oh my gosh. And then it's all brown because of it mixing with the sleet. And it just becomes kind of gross and uninspiring. So
Yeah.
I've kind of written a narrative in my head that like I don't really like the snow. I'm not really interested in ice. I would rather avoid it, and it's kind of like uncomfortable. But then, reading your book gave me a new idea about how to look at it and how to see the opportunity inherent in it. So could you share a little bit about that
Yeah.
landscape and how we can work with it?
Yeah, I love that it's changed your perspective. That makes me so happy. I'm so with you. I mean, I think that snow is just something that, either you love it or you don't love it as much. And it can be difficult to, continue to get outside and enjoy nature when it is really snowy and cold and, kind of miserable. So again, I thought, how can I, explore this in a unique way that people maybe might not have thought about before? And, one sort of idea that came to me was just the sounds of silence, basically, that, find
Mhm.
us when after it snows, and exploring how that can actually be a really positive, force of good, especially
Uh-huh.
if you're like me and live in a city that is just always noisy and sort of cortisol level raising and etc. So that was a really fun chapter to write. I got to speak with some really interesting people who actually study, acoustics and sound, and think about day in and day out how the sounds of nature impact us. And this idea of silence came up like again and again, and I think that it became increasingly clear as I was speaking to them that they sort of see silence almost as like an endangered resource, like it's something that you actually can't
Mm.
find as much of in this day and age. So when you do have access to like a quiet, calm environment, like say after a snowfall, it's really a beautiful opportunity to like get outside and just sort of relish in that silence and maybe have a meditative moment or conduct some sort of ritual that helps you really feel into that sense of calm. So I liked that reframing. I wouldn't say I'm like a huge winter buff, but I'm working on it. I'm trying to really embrace winter for what it is.
Wow. Well, I loved it also because I have such a personal connection with silence as a spiritual practice that I recommend in my book, The Way of the Goddess. And I've even got a whole chapter dedicated basically to silence as the foundation for conscious speech and
Mhm.
as a foundation for healing because it invites you inward to really feel your emotions and to acknowledge them as a catalyst for healing and transformation. So, due to that love of silence, I feel that's what really inspired me to look at snow as a different uh is giving us a different opportunity to really cultivate something that is very important to me. So I love that perspective on it. It's so interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting too, because as I was working on the book, I don't remember the exact stat that I came across and I don't want to butcher it, but just the idea that silence is so uncomfortable for so many people. And, they've done studies about, putting people in a room and asking them to sit quietly, and just sort of like the reactions that people have are so much more extreme than I would think. So
Uh-huh.
it's really a skill worth cultivating, including, you give some great examples of how to do that in your book, but just sitting in silence, I think is a beautiful practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like we need some guidance on how to be with the silence in
Mhm.
order for it to be an invitation for healing and for growth and transformation. Just it by itself can be too much for a lot of people, but once we know that, once we have developed some kind of a practice to work with silence, then I feel there's so many opportunities that that space of silence really gives us to give birth to a new reality and to really know ourselves on a deeper level. And that's kind of like, like metaphorically, I feel the winter season is like that hibernation period, like that going deep within in order to uncover the greatest treasure. And it's almost like the dark night of the soul, right? Because it's even darker for most of the day during the winter. And so it's a time to really go deep into that in order to find the light then, which is like the spring season unfolding. So It's
So
really it's interesting and it's important. It may be hard at times, but it ultimately leads to a greater appreciation of that rebirth that spring gives us, and that we can experience even through the emergence from silence through our speech. So
yeah.
I think there's a lot there that's really fascinating.
And I love that parallel too. Snow sort of helping us on the journey to get quiet. It's quieting things down for us outside.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's so, so cool. Well, and speaking of the spring season, I love that you start this book with the parks and gardens. Can you talk to us about how we can connect with them? I mean, I know we all probably love gardens with flowers and everything, but especially in a big city, how can people cultivate that spiritual connection with nature through the parks and gardens, even if they're small?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, a lot of times I know I'm super guilty of doing this too. Folks who live maybe in a city environment sort of feel like they can't necessarily like connect with nature unless they leave their immediate environment and go off to some like grand, mountain trail or forest or what have you. And I think in the process of writing this book and, speaking with various experts across, the scientific fields, but also just more sort of people who have deeply spiritual connections with nature,
Hmm.
I found that you can have that experience on like a much more small scale or much zoomed in scale. Like you don't need
Hmm.
that vast, prairie, just sort of a pocket park or, something like that will do. I think it really is just a matter of the perspective that we go into it with. I There's just all this fascinating research that finds that, we are inherently more like calm and more at ease. Our heart rate slows, our blood pressure drops when we feel like we're immersed in a natural environment. Um, so I think it's just a matter of focusing your intention on the nature that you do have. One example just from where, I'm based. I'm in New York City. The view from my window is, mostly looking out onto other apartment buildings, but I can see a tiny sliver of a park, outside of my front window. And so whenever I'm sort of feeling stressed or overwhelmed at work or just, things inside are stressing me out and I'd rather not be inside, rather be outside, I just look out and focus my attention on that little patch of green. And, anecdotally, I've just found it to be very, very helpful for me. Um, and so I think that just really, approaching your environment with an appreciation for what you do have and also looking out for like new opportunities to engage with a place in a new way. There's this, it's probably my favorite study that I mentioned in the book, but it's a study that basically they found that when people go out onto a walk when they're adopting a new perspective, so an example would be, heading out pretending that you're a painter looking out for the next color you want to use in one of your pieces of art, or a poet looking for your next muse to write about, or something like that. When you go out into a natural environment with that sort of, lens, it can actually open you up to have an even more like restorative and relaxing experience in that place. And it can also help you see your native environment in a new way. So I think that's just a really fun idea of, thinking about how can I see the places that I walk through every single day with a new lens each time and sort of open myself up to awe and, new discoveries in the same old place. So yeah.
I love that. Yeah, yeah. And in chapter 8 of my book, I talk about embracing new beginnings and this cultivating the sense of wonderment in life and seeing things with fresh new eyes that are informed by the knowledge you gain from the spiritual journey. So I totally resonate with that and think that it's such a great practice. And I think you talked a lot about the importance of that emotion of awe and what it does for our mental health too. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So awe is just a super fascinating emotion, and it's the source of a lot of research right now in the positive psychology space. And the reason why
Oh,
it
okay.
seems to be, yeah, it's super cool. A lot of it is going on out of, I believe, Berkeley is like sort of a big hub for it. But
Makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. But the reason that it seems to be so unique is, awe is sort of that feeling that we get when we're faced with something that we perceive as being very vast. So I think, a
Yeah.
textbook example is like standing at the base of a mountain or at the top of a mountain, or I talk about it a lot in the mountain chapter, but, we
Mhm.
can also feel it when we're listening to really beautiful transportive music or looking at a piece of art that sort of changes, our perspective. And what researchers are finding is that by sort of awe basically makes us feel like small. And in doing so, it opens up our view of the world. And in the process, actually makes us feel like we have more time to spend on the things that we love, essentially. So it makes us just sort of zoom out in more ways than one, which I think is incredibly, beneficial. Um, so yeah, awe is something that I think a lot of us could use more of. And nature is a wonderful place to get it. I know this one researcher is really incredible. His name's Dacher Heltner, and he encourages people to take what he calls awe walks.
Mhm.
So again, it's sort of just this idea that you're heading out with the intention of seeing something new and something that opens your mind up to a new sort of experience. So I love that idea of like infusing just the feeling into your capacity to find awe in the everyday and really leaning into that for the sake of your health, your creativity, all that good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. That's so fascinating about what you said on how awe gives you an increased sense of the time that you have.
Mhm.
I mean, that in itself is so remarkable in a day and age where it feels like our lives are moving so fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can share one like really cool sort of tidbit about this. So there's actually this one study that they did on awe where essentially they like were perched on in like the parking lot area of a national
Mhm.
park. And then
Mhm.
they also were perched, I believe it was a mountain. So like the parking lot and then at the top of the mountain, let's say.
Mhm.
And they asked people to either to fill out like a survey at both spots. And then also they, as a thank you for filling out the survey, let's see if I can remember this correctly, they gave them a bag of trail mix or also presented an opportunity to make their own trail mix.
Okay.
And so they found that in the parking lot environment, people A, took the survey less, and B, like if they did, only took the trail mix and didn't make their own. But at the top, they were more willing to take the survey again because they felt like they had more time to spend. And they
Mhm.
were also more willing to make their own trail mix, which sort of gets at the creativity component. So I don't know. That's just a study that stuck with me too. But I think it feels I can see myself in that situation in the parking lot thinking, like, oh, I don't have time to fill out this survey. I have to, go do this, this, and this. But, I think when we do feel like we are, fully immersed in nature, there is something in us that, says, oh, whatever I had to do doesn't matter. Let me just be in the present moment and, do what I have to do. So I loved that idea.
Yeah, that's so inspiring. I love that practice idea too of just going for a walk with an intention to find some element of nature that resonates with us or connects with us. I know something I really enjoy doing is also in Florida because we have quite a bit of different animals also where I live. I live at a nature preserve and I'm constantly seeing different animals, but some reoccurring ones. Every day while I've lived in Florida, I believe I've seen a lizard.
Oh,
And there's an amazing resource by a friend of mine named Allison Charles called Animal Power, which is a book that teaches you the meaning of the symbols of animals and what they represent for your life. So I just find it so fascinating now to kind of like see all of these creatures as teachers, of something or some metaphor that is important in my life. And I talk about that as a practice too, in the way of the goddess, about seeing what signs and symbols are reoccurring, and understanding the meaning of them, even in your dreams, like if certain uh animals are coming, or even natural landscapes. I feel like now, your book is like decoding what do these natural landscapes stand for, in such an interesting way. And I also love how you have even summarized the chapters also by different keywords or key concepts and themes. I think that's really, really interesting in itself because it gives you a clue as to how you can benefit from the different types of natural environments. So you had talked about community, mindfulness, and discovery in the parks and gardens, which is so amazing. And then I love how you've characterized the oceans and coasts as being, I'll just see and remember what the words were: memory, relaxation, and surrender. And that's like really big. I actually moved to Florida at the beginning of this year because I felt spiritually called to be closer to nature after writing my own book, which it has a lot of memoir and personal stories. And I just felt that, wow, when this comes out, I feel like I want to be close to nature and just experience that surrender to the natural world. That I do agree that oceans and coasts really bring about more so than any other natural environment. And they really give that feeling of like deep relaxation too when you go and walk by the ocean and hear those rhythms. It's like how we were in the womb. It's like going into the womb of the divine being. And I just feel that now I can understand more scientifically how that's working and through the themes that you were talking about. And also how it can bring up a little bit of fear too, because water can be so unpredictable, just like our emotions can be so unpredictable. And it can be a little bit like, oh my gosh, like what's gonna happen now kind of thing, especially when the water builds up and it's storming and things like that. So I found that so interesting in terms of the spiritual quality of surrendering and really feeling that smallness and feeling that sense of humility and connection and cleansing also, which
Yeah.
is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think just the element of water, there's so much to sort of explore there. And, it's like mentioned just sort of this idea that we have all of these elements within us as well. And it's just a
Mhm.
matter of, drawing those connections. And, I think similarly, we have all these, themes that I call out in the book as well. Like we have, some element of, the mountains creativity in us. We have,
Yeah.
the ocean surrender, and it's all just a matter of connecting to that in your outside world, but also finding that within. And I think that there's a lot of personal growth that can happen when you sort of approach it from a landscape lens.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I also loved the forest and trees chapter because with my organization, The Ancient Way, as part of our logo, we have a tree. And a tree has been so symbolic to me of what we're creating as far as something that can have deep roots into the earth so that it can withstand our time and really go on to serve people for a long time, even after we're all gone. So I love how you talk about trees and forest bathing as really therapeutic practices for developing vitality as well as patience and wisdom. And this idea of like what it means to go into the woods, which is like such a spiritual
Yeah.
exploration and going kind of into the unknown to be able to discover our deepest treasures, and how it can also be scary, just like the oceans can be scary, but in a different way. So could you talk a little bit about what it means to go into the woods or into the forest and connect with the trees?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that sort of metaphor of the tree is so beautiful. And again, there are so many parallels, I think, between trees, and their sort of form and structure, and even our own, bodies. I write in the book about this idea of fractal patterns, which is basically just like a repeating pattern that keeps getting smaller and smaller. So a tree branch is a
Yeah.
really nice example. But we also have, if you think about the patterns of our lungs, it's sort of similar.
Mhm.
And I was even talking to a neuroscientist recently, and she was saying that she conceived of thoughts as also having that pattern of, they have this root source and they also have these different branches that we sort of follow, but it's really just about getting down to that root source is where, the healing can really happen. Um, So again, I think there's a really beautiful opportunity to just sort of find where those parallels are,
Mm-hmm.
and find our sort of rootedness, within ourselves. I think, the idea of wisdom came up in that chapter just because I think trees are such a source of just, they can be so old and just like
Mm-hmm.
have stood still for so long. And I think one woman who I interviewed called trees, the great meditators, which I thought was just a beautiful analogy. So I think that there's just so much to connect to in forests, and it's forest bathing is such a fun practice because it sort of just forces you to slow down and really take in your environment when you do. You are surrounded by trees, which are so visually appealing. They also have a beautiful smell, the sounds of the leaves. Like there's just really an opportunity to engage so many senses in the forest. So that was a fun one to work on.
Yeah, yeah, that's so cool. It's so interesting to think about. And how would people do that, even if they don't live in a place with a forest necessarily?
Yeah, absolutely. So forest bathing, I also should have said if anyone's unfamiliar and is picturing like a bath in a forest. Forest bathing is essentially just going into the forest with the intention of, tuning into your environment and moving through the space very slowly
Hmm.
and bathing, in the sort of sensory experience. So it started in Japan. It's called Shirin Yoku in Japanese, the practice, but the way that it's sort of presented is that, you walk through the forest and a guide would lead you, and
Hmm.
they would offer what they call invitations, which I think is a beautiful way to put it. But it essentially invite people to do these different practices that allow them to tune into the environment in a new way. So I think a beautiful example, and one that you don't necessarily need to be in a forest to do, you could do it anywhere outside, um, is just to close your eyes and sort of imagine that you're in a snow globe. This is an invitation I did when I was doing forest bathing a few years ago. But imagine that you're in a snow globe, and then close your eyes and picture the sound that is furthest away and is like hitting the glass of the globe, and just latch on to that. And then you can, do the same thing, close your eyes, and then picture the sound or tune into the sound that is the closest to you. And this is something I do pretty often in nature now, and I just find it really beautiful for just hearing those different layers of noise. I think is
Hmm.
so unique, and I just love that idea of hitting the glass. I think it's just a really cool conceptual way to tune into your environment. So yeah, you can have a sensory experience wherever you are in nature, but I think the forest is just especially rich in things to hear and see and touch.
Wow, that's so interesting. I was doing that while you were talking about it. It's a really, really interesting practice. I'm sure in a place like New York, it would make it even more interesting because you get
Yeah.
so many noises. So it's like, which is the furthest away and which one is right here? And
Yeah,
wow.
like, I don't know if I'd do it in the city, but it could be fun.
That's funny. That's so cool. I love that idea. The snow, you talk about ice and snow, and we talked about silence, and resilience intuitively makes sense because it is challenging to live in a snowed in environment. But could you talk about this idea of a reward? Because you have a reward also as a keyword for the ice and snow chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the idea they were discussing with surf therapy, but just,
Mhm.
conquering a sort of fear is so inherently rewarding. For that snow chapter, I spoke with folks who, I spoke with snowboarder who does like backcountry, sort of snowboarding stuff, and just talked to her about. I think I went into it with the idea of like, oh, this woman must love the cold. She must love the snow. It doesn't bother her. But, I went into these interviews thinking that, and then, everyone would say like, no, I find it uncomfortable too, but what keeps me going back is really just that feeling of reward on the other side, and just, really feeling that discomfort, sitting in it, and then continuing to do what you have to do, skiing down the mountain, or what have you. So I found that to be just like kind of I don't know. It was like permission giving almost, just to say to myself, like, okay, everyone knows that this is uncomfortable to get out on a snowy day, but just go out
Mhm.
prepared and sort of, see what reward is on the other side. But sort of a nice way to reframe it, other than like, oh, I hate the snow and it's just not for me. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This is also an interesting practice idea that you gave about journaling on the snow's themes. So I found that really interesting that you were asking people to consider what opinions or feelings have you held on to for so long that they've frozen over the years and become hardened, fixed, and solid. That's a really interesting question. And even where in your life do you feel stillness? Do you perceive this stillness as constructive or destructive? And then even reflecting on how weather affects your mood and what your favorite type is and what it isn't and why it bothers you. So that's really like an interesting invitation to connect at the emotional level with the seasons and with the idea of the natural world and the cold also.
Yeah, yeah. So like I had forgotten some of those prompts. I'm gonna have to go back and look at it myself. I could use it right now. Yeah, that's great. I mean, yeah, again, I think I included every or some journaling prompts in every chapter. Again, to just sort of, go with this idea that there's something of each landscape to be found in all of us, and just teasing
Mhm.
that out can be interesting, to think about what landscapes are you inherently attracted to and do you feel comfortable in and why, and which ones make you feel a little nervous and a little, less comfortable, and why is that? I think that can be a cool practice.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I love how you've also integrated the hero's journey into the exploration on deserts and drylands. My book, The Way of the Goddess, is definitely like a hero's journey, and it breaks you down and then builds you back up, is how you describe the deserts and just this kind of archetypal hero's journey. So that also really made me connect more with deserts as being a fascinating spiritual place. And you talk also about the phoenix rising from the ashes. Can you just go into that idea of transformation that we get from the desert?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like, the desert, I think broadly, generally speaking, is a pretty like unforgiving environment, and that there aren't that many, resources, not a lot of
Hmm.
rainfall if it's a dry desert.
Right.
And it just sort of doesn't provide some of the creature comforts of other landscapes, and that is an obstacle.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that, that's the reason that a lot of heroes' journeys through literature take place in desert environments.
Uh-huh.
Again, there is that sort of parallel of, life in general just stripping you down and not giving you the
Yeah.
resources you need to thrive, and
Hmm.
how you handle that situation, I think, can be very, very telling. Um, so I forget where my train of thought was going with this, but so I think there's that element of desert, but then something that I love to think about too, and that I find so beautiful and amazing, is just desert plants and how they've found a way to just survive and thrive through through this, environment that really gives them absolutely nothing.
Uh-huh.
But think about something like a succulent stores water in its roots so that it can withstand those, dry environments, and you just sort of adapt to these new ways of being and living to really thrive in the environment that you're in. And I found that really just like inspiring and a cool way to just navigate a desert or any inhospitable environment, sort of look for signs of life and think about how those things have just managed to survive through time, and how sort of like cool and inspiring that is.
I love that. That's so amazing. And then, well, let's move into chapter 7, where you've talked about transcendence. And again, there's a parallel with my book as well, because in chapter 7 of The Way of the Goddess, it's transcending trauma with
Wow.
wisdom. So then you've talked about rivers and streams, and my name, Ripa, is actually Latin for riverbank.
Wow.
So
That's
I know that this is definitely an important landscape for me. And I loved reading this chapter to connect with this idea of transcendence and the idea of the river having its goal to merge with the ocean and to become one with the ocean. And that's so symbolic of the whole spiritual journey of really going beyond our kind of notions of separateness and distinction and individuality to merge with the whole and to go back to our source.
mhm.
And I love this idea of like the river bank or the shores of the ocean, even being as that calm place outside of the flow of emotions and things that we experience and have to ultimately transcend on the spiritual journey. And you've used the three keywords here for both rivers and streams being about cycles, direction, and transcendence. So, could you elaborate on these themes and how the rivers are helping us with these?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think rivers are just a really unique, place for many of the reasons that you just said. They sort of exist to converge into this larger entity. And, I think that when we're standing by the riverside, I think it can just be powerful to think about how, that water is continuing to move forward and, sort of trusting that it'll get to its destination at some point. I think there's just, obviously a very clear metaphor there with, the journey and, the journey through life and the journey to a destination, an ultimate end. And
Hmm.
a lot of the writing that I did for that chapter is actually about this idea of like returning to a river and going back to a river again and again.
Yeah.
That was something that came up a lot for me, just, again, maybe it does have to do with that journey and that revisiting, but I think that alone can be a really beautiful practice just to go back to a river that you might have had an experience with, in your youth or, years
Hmm.
ago and, consider how you've changed since you were last there, like how your journey has shifted, how you've evolved. And I don't know, I think there's just something really powerful about sitting by the river, which also tends to be like a very fertile ground, which I think is telling. Um, but yeah, just using it as a means of reflection, I think can be really special. It can unlock things. At least for me, it has that I don't know if I would have gone before.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And that's so interesting. And just this idea of transcendence also that comes with it, I feel is so fascinating. And you also talk about asking the river what it can teach you as a practice, which is really cool. What kinds of things have you learned from the river?
Um, I think there's just excuse me, I think it's a lot about trust, like sort of
Mhm.
trusting, the process and continuing to move forward, whether there's a rock in your way, physically or metaphorically. But yeah, just having that element of like knowing your direction and following that is so powerful. And I feel like that's sort of, a huge part of life that can be very challenging. But just having that sort of resolute direction, um, I think is so important.
Mhm. I love that. That's so interesting. And then in chapter 8, you talk about cities and built environments, which seems like kind of paradoxical to the idea of returning to nature. But you talk about the benefits actually to nature of having cities and how cities are also offering us respite, reciprocity, and humanity. So could you talk a little bit about how cities and built environments can be places where we can still return to nature and reconnect and appreciate nature. And I love that it went to New York City because I've also lived in New York City pretty recently while I was writing my last book. And it seems like the most remote place away from nature. But you also live there. So I would love to hear your thoughts about the role of places like New York City when we're talking about returning to nature.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like the great irony that I wrote this book. City. I wrote it during I started working on the book in March of 2020, so COVID.
Wow.
Going into it, I had these grand ideas to travel and, go to different remote landscapes as I was writing to really feel into these places.
Uh-huh.
And then I ended up not being able to do that, obviously. But, I think through the process, it sort of forced me to find these places in my place, which ended up being, I think, incredibly valuable for
Mm-hmm.
me. And, it really changed the way that I see and engage with the city. But yeah, I think anyone who lives in a city environment can really find elements of all these different landscapes in their immediate vicinity. Depending on where you live, you might have access to a small pocket park, or, you might be able to see a few street trees, or just sort of finding, again, those like pared down examples, I think it can be really rewarding. And it also just ties back to this idea that in it from like a conservation perspective, I don't want to encourage people to like feel like they need to take a transatlantic flight or what have you to get to nature. I think there's just a lot of value in finding that wherever you might live, and it's ultimately a lot gentler on the planet if we're not all just running to some pristine place. So I think that there's real beauty in finding the nature wherever you live. And again, going back to the idea that like humans really are nature, so our creation, our concrete buildings, as ugly as they may be, are also, I don't know, they can be considered maybe an expression of nature, and there's beauty to be found there too. But I think there's also just the idea that like enjoying nature with other people and being surrounded by other people can be really special on its own, because it sort of it's I think it disarms us a lot of time if we are able to get out with other people, take a walk outside versus, I don't know, have a conversation indoors. I think it brings down a lot of barriers for reasons unknown, but I think it just people feel more comfortable outside a lot of the time.
Wow, yeah, that's so amazing. I love that. Wow, so this has been such an amazing journey through each of the chapters of your book and the natural landscapes. And I think you've interviewed quite a lot of experts also to inform each chapter of your book and how we can connect with these different landscapes. So where do people get your book and also just learn more about you and keep up with you?
Yeah. Well, thank you for guiding the journey. Your questions were so yeah, they were like really thoughtful. So thank you. um,
Oh, my pleasure.
but in terms of where to get the book, wherever books are sold, it should be, online. And if it's not in your local bookstore, I would love it if you asked. I love being in bookstores. So yeah, wherever books are sold, my website is my name, Emma Loewe, Loewe, .com. And my Instagram is at EMMLOEWE. So just no A. But you can keep up with my writing on Mind Body Green. And yeah, those are the main places. And my first book, which we have the same publisher, which I love, Book Sisters. It's called The Spirit Almanac. So that's a bit of a like more sort of spiritual self-care angle, but it's a cute one too.
Amazing. Yeah, I would love to read that book. It's been on my reading list for some time, so I'll definitely have to check it out, especially considering we are published by the same imprint of Penguin. So that's really, really fun. Well, thank you so much again, Emma, for coming on the podcast and sharing with us. Is there any last bit of wisdom that you would like to share with our listeners, especially as it relates to returning to nature?
Yeah, I mean, I would just encourage people to get outside today and see where it leads them, um, in more ways than one. But thank you so much for having me, Ananta. This was fun. I always love chatting with you.
Likewise, thank you so much.